Happy Monday.
Happy Monday, Joe. How was your Thanksgiving?
It was very minimal.
Yeah,
It was just my family and me. I think taking a break from extended family. So, how about
yeah,
yours?
yeah. Same way. Yeah, very small. Just made a bunch of food basically. And that was the
Yeah,
day. No people. Yeah.
yeah, it's fine. It's the theme of the year. Meanwhile, I look across my neighborhood and I see like huge groups of people gathering for Thanksgiving. So, I just mentioned it like, oh yeah, so we'll be avoiding that family and that family and that family for the next couple of weeks. So.
Yeah. Speaking of data, I hope the stats this week are kind of okay in Utah. We shall see.
Oh, yeah, not even gonna get into that one.
Yeah, yeah, no.
So, well, cool. Switching gears a bit, I think we wanted to talk about something that comes up quite a bit. In our meetings, it's
Came up this morning, which is kind of why we thought of it on a call with some partners. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the notion really is like, how do you think about single cloud, multi-cloud, and hybrid cloud? This comes up all the time.
Right.
And so we want to kind of explain the differences between each approach, the pros and cons of each, and give our perspective on maybe how you can be successful. So,
Yeah, and why these things show up organizationally, we see some pretty standard patterns, reasons that companies get into hybrid cloud or multi-cloud, and how you should think strategically in the long term. Yeah,
mhm. Let's start with definitions really quick. So, a single cloud is self-explanatory, right? So you're on one cloud. So this is also called the public cloud. In most cases, this refers to clouds like AWS, which is Amazon Web Services, Azure, which is owned by Microsoft. You have Google Cloud, which we'll call GCP here. And then you have some others. Ali Cloud, that's more popular in China. If you're doing anything in China, you're probably going to be doing Ali Cloud. And then I would say there's some smaller players. You got your IBMs, your Oracles, your HPs, and your Rackspaces of the world. We're not going to talk too much about those just because we're going to focus on the big three clouds, which have captured
right.
the majority of the market share right now. So,
Yeah, and that's not to say that we're counting these other clouds completely out. It's just that right now they're not really on our radar. That could change in the next year or two. The market is evolving pretty rapidly, and it's growing very rapidly too.
hmm
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so, we've discussed, a single public cloud. So what would a hybrid cloud be?
So hybrid cloud is actually the most common scenario that we deal with day to day. And that's because most of our clients have some kind of on-prem infrastructure, right? They're generally not born in the cloud. They've got an on-prem data center and they have some big databases running to support their applications. They have a data warehouse of some sort. They have a bunch of virtual machines. And then typically they make the decision to go to the cloud due to some business advantage that they identify. So maybe they have a big data use case that fits better on the cloud. And so, at least initially, they have to connect these systems together. Very few clients want to all at once try to rip out what they have and move it all to the cloud. That's a huge undertaking, and most companies just don't have the appetite to do that. And so, it's a hybrid. You're going to have on prem plus cloud. You might have a plan to get fully cloud within a couple of years, or you might be okay with the hybrid situation indefinitely.
hmm Yeah, in a few situations, I mean, we find hybrid works really well. Like if you're a fintech company, for example,
Hmm?
and you have an on-prem system, we'd probably advise you keep that on-prem system actually until you have a good reason to move it into cloud. I know there's going to be a lot of security considerations that you'll need to work through, and if you have an on-prem system that works, especially in a setting where you need utmost security, move a lot more carefully than maybe another type of company that can move very quickly to the cloud. So,
Yeah, yeah, it's like some of the use cases we talked about for real time last week, and some of those were fintech, and specifically like Wall Street trading, for example. Those companies are not going to be moving fully to the cloud anytime soon because they need ultra low latency to connect to exchanges, and so they're going to keep some of their own infrastructure running highly customized code to manage those use cases. And in general, with fintech, you see similar things. Companies that process huge numbers of transactions often want to own their own databases for that purpose, but then some of their other analytics use cases might move to cloud, for example.
right.
Yeah.
So we talked about single clouds, we talked about hybrid cloud. What would multi-cloud be?
So multi-cloud is, well, I guess it's what it sounds like. It means that you have several clouds and you have infrastructure running on each one. It could be just two clouds, or it could be like five for some reason. And I think organically, we generally see this occurring for organizational reasons, and that's that different parts of the company just choose their own clouds, and then they're forced to integrate together at some point. But we'll talk later about strategic reasons why you might want to deliberately choose this path.
Mm-hmm. I think multi-cloud too, it's becoming, I would say, more and more recognized
Right.
and utilized, right? So I think Google Cloud especially is making some pretty big strides to push its multi-cloud offering.
Mm-hmm.
A year ago or 2 years ago, they had a beta, but they released Anthos, and that gives you the promise of running your applications across any cloud. I suppose one of the considerations is you got to figure out a good use case to utilize all the clouds, or a multi-cloud approach, right? So but we'll get more into that as well. So
yeah, there are several that spring to mind right away, which we'll get to in a minute. Yeah.
yeah, and so circling back, I mean, when we talk about things like hybrid cloud, I mean, what are some of the advantages of taking this approach?
Yeah, I think one of the main ones is that, well, it's another thing we were discussing earlier this morning, and that's that traditional lift and shift just doesn't tend to work that well. And what I mean by lift and shift is that you take your server images, you take all the code you're running on-prem right now, and you just move it onto cloud virtual machines. You can do that, but there's just not a lot of advantage to taking that approach versus continuing to run your own servers. Usually, if you're going to make a cloud transition, we recommend that you try to transition to doing things in a cloud native way. And so move maybe from possibly a Teradata system to Amazon Redshift, for example, moved to a serverless paradigm, perhaps. And those transitions take a lot of time, right? Because switching the code you're running, the infrastructure you're running, isn't just a technical problem, it's a whole organizational and training problem. And it involves a lot of rebuilding. And so typically what we'll recommend to our clients is that they start out in this hybrid world, come up with a roadmap, and then gradually migrate things over from on-prem to the cloud in a cloud native way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that being a hybrid cloud is going to be a lot harder than being multi-cloud, for example, because of the
Yeah,
inherent, as you point out, organizational
right.
and technical challenges that you may face. For example, the way you write applications and software and maybe your data analytics and on-prem system is definitely not going to be the same way you do things in the cloud. There's
Right.
fundamental differences. For example, if you don't have a good DevOps or data ops practice in your on-prem, um, and you try and replicate your practices in the cloud, I think as you're sort of alluding to, there might be some expense to that, right? So if you're just
Right.
migrating your applications to new VMs in the cloud, I'm going to wager you actually might spend more money in the cloud if you're just doing things the way you did
Absolutely.
on-prem. And
Yeah.
if your development practices are the same, if you haven't developed things like at least some progression of a DevOps or data ops model
Mhm.
or an ML ops, like it's going to be challenging and probably very expensive for you actually.
Yeah.
So
I mean, critics of the cloud point out that if you go to Amazon EC2 and you price out an instance and say, okay, this is how much it's going to cost for me to run this instance for a year, 3 years, 5 years, and then you price out, say, a machine from Dell or HP with the same capabilities, Amazon in the long term is going to cost you a lot more. But that's because, well, actually, the advantage of cloud, though, is that I don't have to pay for that server 24 hours a day. I can just turn it off when I'm not using it. You don't do that on-prem because there's no advantage, right? I've paid for that server, and so I might as well just leave it running, SSH into it, babysit it as I need to. Whereas on cloud, you really want to shift toward the paradigm of just paying for servers when you need them and then scaling up and down dynamically. And that's where the savings come from, and also agility.
right, or adopting, I should say, cloud
Yeah.
native practices like serverless,
Yeah.
wherever possible,
Yeah.
managed
Cloud
services,
functions
and then
or,
let somebody
yeah,
else deal with it, right? So
exactly.
in that
Yeah.
case, it becomes more cost effective. Again, though, you have to look at your data volumes because serverless
Yep.
also becomes cost ineffective at certain points. And I guess if you reach a certain point, with your hybrid model or your on-prem or your cloud model only or whatever, where the costs make more sense to switch solely to one or the other, then I guess you make a determination. There are definitely some companies where it makes total sense to be only on-prem because your data volumes at a such, at a certain point or such that you're just probably better off having your own infrastructure. But that's, I would say for the majority of the companies out there, hybrid's probably fine. Using a single cloud is probably fine, actually, and multi-cloud, which we'll get into a bit, is perfectly fine. I mean, because we're talking, the scale of something like an Uber or a Netflix or somebody like that, and like you're probably not one of those companies if I'm, especially if you're listening to our video. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the point is that we're not saying that any of these approaches is the end all be all. It's just we're mapping out some considerations for making choices, and also for the long-term evolution. There's the short-term, what I have to do today, and there's also deciding where do I want to be in 2 years, in 5 years. And every company is going to have a different answer depending on what their needs are. Yeah.
So we discussed, maybe some approaches on a hybrid cloud. What would be some thoughts around multi-cloud here?
Yeah, so I think going back to what I said earlier, that many companies end up with multi-cloud organically. You really want to have in your company some kind of a task force to map out your assets in different clouds and to actually try to make a strategic plan and to say, okay, does it make sense to have this running on AWS and this other piece running on GCP, or should we try to consolidate those somehow? And also to strategically say, well, maybe our infrastructure makes more sense on AWS, but our data makes more sense on GCP, and some Microsoft workloads make sense on Azure. I guess going back to one of your favorite topics, just like planning, right? Fundamentally, it's all about just actually making a plan and sitting down and doing a careful technical assessment rather than just having kind of this free range, everyone has their own cloud and their own assets. That gets very, very complicated, and it becomes a security risk at some point if people aren't coordinating between those different components.
Yeah, we've seen this at a few companies where I think they took the approach of let's let every team do its thing, right? And choose its own technologies. And by technologies, they also meant clouds and the respective technologies in those clouds. And there's been some interesting dilemmas with that approach. Things like security is definitely a big one. DevOps deployment's a really big one. Data ops is a big one. Egress fees, which we'll get into a bit, that's a giant one. When your team surprisingly, racked up a surprise $20,000 bill because they're shipping data over to the cloud, between clouds, that's kind of an issue. And so there's a number of things, plus just the amount of context switching, right? And so I think there's kind of two threads to the multi-cloud discussion. On one hand, we're in a position now, I would say by we, I mean, cloud practitioners, and that you can choose the best of breed technologies from each cloud. There's some awesome technologies in AWS, GCP, and Azure. And I could make a strong argument. I'm not going to name names of these technologies, but I would say that particular technologies are the best of the three. And in some cases, it may make sense to utilize them across the different clouds. Of course, there's another thread when you're talking about commonalities of deployment, right, and consistencies of deployment. In which case, you'd want to use containers and maybe something like Kubernetes, which now exists in all the clouds. And this means you can just deploy your workloads into any cloud or on-prem, and your application should run the same regardless. So yeah, kind of two threads. On one hand, get, like you said, best of breed, and on the other hand, kind of universal deployments of containers. So
yeah, and I think you want to think a lot about the services that each cloud offers. One of the transitions that I think is good when you're going into a cloud native mindset is to think in terms of services rather than deploying everything on your own. And so if you're very Microsoft heavy, then managed Active Directory service on Azure is probably going to be a pretty nice asset for you. And you're going to have nice managed options for a SQL Server, for example. If you're a Postgres shop, then Amazon Redshift is probably going to be a very nice service for you for data warehousing because it is Postgres behind the scenes. And so it's going to be very familiar in how it works, but it offers the advantages of managed service in terms of scalability and just less having to deal with software updates and infrastructure and such.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's also a newer paradigm too, where even third-party services like Snowflake, right? So you could set these up in one cloud, but maybe set up an account in another Snowflake account in another cloud and still do data sharing between the two. So
Mhm.
what I think we also starting to see, from the third party ecosystem, third party meaning products that aren't proprietary to these clouds or managed by these clouds is, um, sort of at a minimum working in any of the clouds, so Azure, GCP, or AWS, but also working between the clouds. I think we're starting to see more of that now. So again, the common complaint with any of these approaches is it comes down to, egress fees is a really big one, right? So,
Right.
because now you have this common platform, so there's really not too much context switching from an interface point of view or from a practices point of view, except the fact that you do need to keep track of where your data is, coming and going, and we can talk more about that in a second. But that always pops up as one of the main criticisms of, sort of a multi-cloud approach, but.
Yeah. I mean, to be frank, I think this has been a very strategic move by the cloud vendors, right? Data egress fees are intended to keep your data where it lives already and not let it go somewhere else because it's viewed as sticky and it keeps the customer engaged with that cloud.
Yeah, as I've expressed in other times, I think my opinion on egress fees is I kind of see them as like cell phone minutes. Back in the, if you had a cell
Yeah.
phone back in the late 90s or, early 2000s, probably through the mid 2000s, it was, you're charged by X number of minutes on your phone. And I think
Right.
the notion of egress fees is kind of going to go the way of the dinosaur at some point. I mean, Oracle sort of
Yeah.
took a first stab at this with their, the
Yeah.
acquisition of, Zoom as a customer on the Oracle
Yeah.
cloud. I mean, up to then, despite what Oracle will probably say, I didn't really ever hear them mentioned in the same sentences as the big three clouds.
Right.
We usually heard people wanting to move away from Oracle, and that's not a knock against Oracle. It just is what we've heard. But at the same time, we did, read about the egress fees being a major consideration for a company like Zoom, and I've heard counter arguments. I've heard people say, "Oh, well, egress fees, they'll, clouds don't want to have to subsidize that, and they're better off taking that money and reinvesting it." But I think as multi-cloud becomes, more and more of a contender as a paradigm for how companies will operate between clouds, I think it's only a matter of time before uh, somebody makes the move and drops egress fees entirely. So it's
Yeah.
a prisoner's
And it's going
dilemma
to
at the
be
end of the day.
right. Exactly.
Somebody's going to make the move. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Yeah, so it could be Oracle that triggers this eventually if they win enough key contracts against the major vendors, then at some point they might decide to change their tune. And there's a flip side to egress fees as well, and that's that right now the clouds subsidize ingress. Like ingress basically ends up being free, and because they want you to bring your data in, right? And they want you to bring your customers into their clouds. So if egress fees go away, then that big subsidy might go away as well at some point.
Yeah.
Like they have to pay for that network traffic somehow. It's got to come out of some pot of money.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was a fun tangent.
Yeah, as
uh,
usual.
as usual. And so, what are some suggestions that we would have for companies that are considering or doing a hybrid or multi-cloud?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest suggestions that I want to emphasize is that if you're doing hybrid or multi-cloud, there's a tendency to think that you can save money somehow by keeping a lot of stuff on-prem. And that you're only dipping your toe into the cloud. So you don't need super high competency. You can kind of have a team that's just starting on the cloud and be okay. But really, if you want to do hybrid or multi-cloud, you need to have a higher level of skill with your team than you would otherwise. And that's because doing integrated networking is much harder than doing cloud native networking. That's just a frank fact. If you're doing cloud native networking, the configurations are generally pretty straightforward. If you need to do hybrid networking, there are a lot more details to think about in terms of network engineering. And so my point is that if you're doing hybrid or multi-cloud, get your teams a lot of training. Make sure that they get certified on the appropriate cloud and that they also have a lot of technical competence in their specialization area beyond that cloud. So for example, network engineering team, get them all cloud certified, get them cloud network certified, and make sure that they keep up with their on-prem skills too, so that they can do
Mm-hmm.
that integration successfully.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I would say for a multi-cloud environment, especially consider what's called the thinnest viable platform. So invest
Hmm.
in stuff like containers or Kubernetes. I think especially when you're starting out, this gives you the flexibility of choosing and settling on what the best cloud. And there could be a situation too where if you're especially if you're optimizing for cost, you could run a workload on one cloud that might be cheaper than another, especially if you're using spot instances. So definitely experiment with stuff like that. I would definitely advise trying not to get tied in too much at the beginning if you're exploring the option of hybrid or multi-cloud, just because by definition you're giving yourself more optionality, and so that would also necessitate you're doing things that will give you more options, at least until you settle on something that works for you. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Do things in a fairly agile way.
mhm.
So that flexibility.
Yeah, but at the same time, though, once you've settled on something, I would say you can continue rolling stuff on your own, writing your own software, and there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. But there may be, an option for using, more best of breed managed or proprietary services
Hmm.
within each of the clouds, right? So, and this would come
Yeah.
down to, again, evaluating what's the future uh, of these particular solutions that we're choosing, as well as, what's my exit plan if I don't want to use this anymore, right? So, I mean, you certainly don't want to get
Yeah.
stuck.
Yeah.
We talked about this last week in our locked in, or maybe the week before in our locked in
Yeah.
discussion, right? So, everything is locked in, but if you can avoid, if you can be the best version of Houdini that you can be, like you should be that version instead of getting yourself trapped. So, again, this
Yeah.
is always going to be a constant discussion, and I don't think it's particular to multi-cloud, cloud, or hybrid. It's just, but again, there are a lot of great options out there, and every vendor is going to tell you their product is awesome and beats everybody else. And so, make sure you've done your homework, um, and have an exit plan. And kind of on that note, I would say
Yeah.
make sure you're paying attention to what vendors are telling you in terms of benchmarks. I notice, and I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of vendors out there that all compete with each other, and they use the same benchmarks. And somehow, each of these vendors is better than the other one, even though they're all using the same benchmarking data. And so, I don't know who to believe. You shouldn't either. You should go do your own homework and go talk to people and make a decision on
Yeah.
your own.
Yeah, there's so many benchmarking sins that we see. So for example, they'll just hyper optimize their product behind the scenes. So they'll like do a really complex star schema benchmark and they'll pre-index all the joins, or maybe they'll use a bunch of materialized views so the joins basically happen in advance. And so you get this amazing performance. And then whatever the competitor will have some other way of optimizing, right? Like Teradata versus BigQuery versus Redshift versus Snowflake. The optimizations in each platform are different. When they run to the benchmarks, they really don't optimize the competitor's product at all. And in fact, they might say things like, oh, the competitor doesn't support pre-index joins. Like, yeah, but they have this other way of optimizing, which you're not doing. And so it's not at all an apples to apples comparison you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So don't trust
So,
benchmarks that are put out basically by marketing. Like, yeah, tech teams are putting them out, but these are basically just in
and
many
I think
cases, marketing junk.
yeah, we
Yeah.
might do a separate video on, I think, benchmarking and how to do your own evaluations and stuff. But again, just something else to be aware of as you get into any of the clouds or any of the products that work with clouds. Everyone's going to have an opinion on like what's the best product out there. At the end of the day, do your homework like you would with anything else. I'd say another consideration is licensing, right?
Yeah.
So some of these clouds, depending on the product, you can bring your own license. In other cases, you have to buy a license.
Yeah.
Consider that. And there's also certain clouds that might make life difficult if you have Microsoft licenses. And
Or
so,
Oracle.
or
Yes.
Oracle, right? Um, so, figure out which ones those are and figure out a game plan around it. So,
Yeah. One thing I've been hearing a lot about lately is bare metal services. And so these cloud vendors will offer bare metal services to get around some of these licensing restrictions. The licensing restrictions tend to really crack down on the use of virtual machines. And so basically, AWS or Google will rent you almost like a bare metal server to run Oracle, Microsoft, whatever on. Now, there's not a lot of advantage to that, right? It's not particularly cloud native, but the advantage is that I can have that service and then I can use other cloud native stuff directly integrated with it in the same data center or region.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's an idea to be aware of. Don't get into the cloud and then discover that you're paying, 3 times as much for Oracle or SQL Server because of licensing restrictions that are based on, per core or some other metric that gets really, really expensive in a virtualized world.
Yeah, and I think on that note too, also look at the the compliance and regulation
Yeah.
compatibility of the clouds, right? So and consider if you have to comply with certain laws, say GDPR, for example, there's going to be location um, uh, considerations, right? Like you may have to have your servers in Europe and not here. You may need to, or you may need to set up different accounts in different countries depending on the legalities there and depending on how your business is set up. So there's a lot of things I would say if you have a legal team and you have to do international facing business and deployments, definitely take these things into consideration. Or say you're going to China, for example, right? Well, you can use the very limited number of regions, if they're even available for all the big three clouds we just discussed. Ollie Cloud may be another option for you, but then you need to consider, okay, so if you're using Ollie Cloud, what does that look like, right? From a security
Right.
perspective, from a compliance perspective, from a legal perspective, from an operational perspective, all this other stuff, right? So, um, but if you don't have those, international or compliance considerations, then you don't need to deal with it. But at some point in time, you have regulatory compliance issues you need to deal with, regardless of wherever you're operating, because that's just the nature of like running a company in any country, right? So,
Yeah.
and this is like the boring stuff, but this is also stuff you want to pay attention to because, uh, lack of compliance isn't really an excuse, or not understanding compliance isn't an excuse for like not complying. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, but I notice one of the things I've seen with on-prem compliance teams is that they're kind of they tend to be a bit behind in their understanding compliance standards and maybe kind of have still a 90s or an early 2000s mindset. And so in addition to investing in training of engineers and such, you might need to invest in training of your compliance teams to kind of understand how things work in the cloud. And especially as you're getting into potentially having data centers all over the world, because you're going to access any data center through the cloud. What does that look like from a compliance standpoint? And also risk, not just like what's the law, but also, okay, what are some things that we have to think about in terms of risk going internationally, and how do we mitigate that risk?
mhm. And I would say some other considerations along this line too is, security is a big one. If you're going to do a hybrid cloud model, for example, look at a direct connection between your on-prem and the cloud. You can go over the
Yeah.
public internet, but these clouds do offer options, direct connections where you just pay a fee, either directly to the cloud or maybe to a third-party provider. But in any case, what you get is a fast, optimized, and very secure network. And in some cases, too, you also alleviate the need to pay egress fees, for example.
Or
Exchange.
dramatically reduce them. Yep. It's
Yep,
a huge reduction in
exactly.
egress fees. I mean, you're paying that
Yeah,
monthly cost for the line, but you get the performance plus you're not paying the corresponding egress cost. Yeah. It can make a huge
right.
difference.
Especially if you have large data volumes, you need to keep them secure. It's just definitely the way we'd recommend going. And
Yeah.
so, and some other ways you can get your data into the cloud, like if you have too much data, for example, right, and it can't go
Yep.
over the wire, you can have the cloud just send you a box, and in the box might be a hard drive that you can put your data on and then send it back. If your data is big enough, Amazon, I know, will send you a giant semi truck and you can just put your data in there and they'll drive it out to the data
I
center.
think they
So
do that for show. That's got to be it, right? Does anyone have that much data? I think people just probably executives like to drive around in semi
I would
trucks
think
and
that
see a
maybe
whole
a
bunch.
giant data center would,
Yeah, it's quite possible if
right?
you're a data intensive
Yeah.
business, actually.
Yeah, like if you're like a
Yeah,
data center and you need to back it up and move it, I could see a use case for that. But like
yeah.
I don't know,
But it's kind of
we don't
like every
really.
5-year-old stream. Yeah, it's just like this gigantic truck that's
Yeah, I mean,
huge data center on
we have
wheels.
this hard drive here, and this is like 4 terabytes here.
Yeah.
I mean that's not that much data even, but you know, that's our on-prem backup, I guess. So, cool, man. Is there anything
We
else
don't
we?
have 10
What's
petabytes
that?
yet. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
One other thing I'll mention. We don't have 10
yeah.
petabytes yet, but maybe someday we will. But yeah, one other
Okay.
thing to piggyback onto your comments about egress earlier. In general, it really helps to build data flow diagrams and then make
Hmm.
decisions about your architecture from that perspective. So as you're thinking about things like egress, is the data going to flow into the cloud, out of the cloud? How's that going to affect your costs? So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's a big one. Well, cool. I think that about covers it. I think the conclusion of what we're talking about is there's not a right or wrong answer for whether you should do single cloud, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud. At the end of the day, do what makes sense for you. Just do your homework. I would say the
Right.
biggest issues that we see are when companies don't do their homework, um, and in particular, don't try and understand things from a cloud native way of doing things. This is more
Right.
particular to hybrid cloud, but even when you're talking about multi-cloud, right, there are nuances between all the clouds that need to be understood. AWS isn't the same as Azure, and Azure isn't the same as GCP. None of these are the same. They all have their
Right.
own ways of doing stuff. They have some common ways of doing stuff, and there's some very peculiar ways of doing stuff. And if you try and approach AWS the same way as you do Azure, you're not going to have a very fun time, right? So
That's right. Yeah.
how it is. So just do your homework, understand what you're getting into. Reach out to consultants if you have questions. People like us, shameless plug. Um, but yeah, and just be smart about it. So do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just, I mean, if you're an established business, then you'll almost certainly have to think about these issues at some point. Companies that were born in the cloud maybe don't, but everyone else should be thinking about these from the get-go, even before they start getting into cloud, so that they don't end up with a huge sprawling mess.
Yep.
We've seen
Well, awesome. Well,
many
I think
times.
that
So
yeah,
yeah,
seen many times. I think it's a good place to stop. So I hope you
yeah,
enjoy your Monday, and we'll see you next week for the Monday morning data chat. So take it easy.